I know what I'm about to tell might sound like a made-up story, but what happened to me was real. Even today, I sometimes wonder if I was losing my mind, or if something truly supernatural was happening in that place. I moved into a modest apartment, a simple spot in the center of a quiet neighborhood. It was exactly what I needed to start over after ending a toxic relationship. At first, it seemed like the perfect place, no surprises. The apartment was clean and well-maintained, with basic furniture, and the neighborhood was quiet, giving me a sense of peace. I was happy to have my own space again, a refuge where I could finally recover. But shortly after settling in, strange things started to happen. They were small changes, but enough to unsettle me. I noticed objects slightly out of place. I was sure I had left my book on the coffee table, but sometimes I found it on the shelf. At first, I thought it was all in my head. Maybe the stress of the breakup was making me imagine things. And then lights began to flicker in an unusual way, almost like a short circuit, though the electrician couldn't find anything wrong. To make it worse, I started receiving mysterious voice messages in my voicemail, messages that made no sense, whispers saying incomprehensible words. I was becoming paranoid and didn't know what to think until the day I found that door. It was just an ordinary day, a Tuesday night when everything changed. I was in my bedroom organizing some things in the closet when I noticed something strange. I'd always stored my clothes there and had never seen a hidden door behind the shelves. It was locked, and what disturbed me most was that I had never noticed its presence before. A chill ran down my spine as though it had been there the whole time, but I'd just never realized it. Curiosity got the better of me, and without hesitation, I searched for a key. It took me a few minutes to find an old key, seemingly left behind long ago. When I finally unlocked the door, I found a dusty room that smelled of mildew with a suffocating sense of abandonment. Inside that room, there was a diary. The cover was worn and covered in dust, but when I opened it, the first words made me freeze. The diary was full of details about my life, things no one else could know. It described recent events, my toxic relationship, even my move to that apartment, things I had never shared with anyone. I stood paralyzed, holding the diary, unable to comprehend how someone could know all that. The entries became even stranger, speaking of the apartment, the person who had lived there before me, and how they had left never to return. I felt a weight on my chest, as if I were being watched, and for a moment, I almost thought I heard a whisper coming from the room itself. Fear took hold of me, and I quickly closed the diary, but something deep inside me knew I couldn't just ignore what I had found. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words from the diary kept echoing in my mind. I kept asking myself if it was all just a coincidence, or if there was really something wrong with that apartment. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour. I tried to brush it off, but the small, unsettling details kept piling up. The lights flickered, objects continued to move out of place, and I swore I heard footsteps in the hallway, as if someone were tiptoeing, trying not to wake me. I'd look out the window, but no one was there. The city seemed normal, but I no longer felt safe. When I looked in the mirror, something sent a chill through me. On the glass, there was a water stain, as if someone had touched it while I was out. I thought of all the possibilities, but none of them made sense. Then something truly bizarre happened. During the day, I checked my voicemail, and what I found shook me to my core. A message, recorded in a low, soft voice, said only, "I see you." My skin instantly crawled, and I deleted the message, trying to convince myself it was a prank. But the voice was different. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. I had no idea where it came from, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the first time someone had left strange messages for me. A sense of dread consumed me, and the feeling that I wasn't alone in that apartment became unbearable. It was as if someone had invaded my privacy, and it had nothing to do with the relationship I'd ended months ago. The next night, I made a decision. I had to find out what was going on. Ignoring the fear building inside me, I decided to thoroughly investigate the apartment. I was determined to find a logical explanation, some clue that could clarify the messages and strange occurrences. I searched every corner, every cabinet, every shelf, but the apartment felt increasingly empty. Not empty of furniture, but empty as if something or someone was constantly absent, waiting to be found. At the bottom of the last drawer, where I kept old papers and photos, I found something that made my heart race. A photograph. It was an old picture of a woman sitting on a couch, staring directly at the camera with a forced smile on her face. I didn't recognize her, but something about the photo sent a deep chill through me, as though she was watching me. It felt like I was next. I couldn't stay in the apartment that night. I went to the balcony, trying to breathe deeply, but my body was tense. When I looked down, I saw something I couldn't explain, a shadow quickly passing by the window of the neighboring apartment, as if someone was moving inside. But that apartment was empty. No one lived there. I was sure of it. By this point, the coincidences no longer seemed accidental. I was being watched. I didn't know by whom or why, but I was. When I went back inside, the feeling of being followed was so intense I couldn't ignore it any longer. It felt as though I was being watched from every angle, as if the apartment itself was alive and bearing witness to something no one else could see. I felt paralyzed, not knowing what to do next, as though the very space around me was consuming me. The following morning, I decided to visit the building's management office to get some answers. I asked about the apartment's history, about its previous tenants, but the receptionist was evasive. She didn't give me any details about the place's past, but told me, with a forced smile, that the building has a long history. That didn't convince me. With a little else to do, I returned to the apartment, once again feeling that oppressive air, a sense that something was about to happen. While I was in the kitchen, the lights flickered again, almost as if they were calling out to me. I no longer knew if I was imagining things or truly losing my mind. My phone rang, and when I looked, I saw a new voicemail message from an unknown number. The message, if it could even be called that, was a distorted recording, like a muffled and distant voice. But amidst the noise, I managed to make out a few words that chilled me to the bone. "You're next, Lauren." Panic consumed me. How did they know my name? What did they want from me? I couldn't take it anymore. I locked all the doors and windows, trying to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Suddenly, the lights went out, and the only sound I could hear was something or someone moving at the back of my closet. I didn't know what to do. I glanced at the mirror and briefly saw a reflection that wasn't mine. It was a woman with the same vacant look as the one in the photograph I had found. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. When I turned to look behind me, the shadow was already gone. But the fear remained. Something was there watching me, and I didn't know if I could escape it. That night, I went to bed, but sleep didn't come. I stayed alert, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door, fearing what might happen. Every little sound seemed amplified, and I felt increasingly suffocated by the sensation of being watched. Finally, at 3 a.m, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, turned on all the lights, and went to the closet. The locked door was still there, but now something felt different. The hallway light illuminated the small space, and for a moment I felt as though I was being called to open the door. With trembling hands, I took the key and turned it in the lock. The scraping sound of the metal was the only noise breaking the oppressive silence. Inside, I found the diary again. But now, flipping through the pages, I noticed something new. The diary didn't just detail my life. It also spoke about my childhood, my past relationship, and my deepest fears. How was this possible? It was as if someone had been living my life, watching every step, every move. When I finally reached the last page, I found a message written in red ink. "I'm not the first, you won't be the last." Those words burned into my mind. The lights began flickering again, and then, out of nowhere, I heard a sound coming from the other side of the apartment, like someone lightly knocking on the front door. My heart raced. I knew it wasn't the wind, and I knew I wasn't alone. When I went to the door, I hesitated, but when I opened it, there was no one there, only an envelope lying on the floor. Inside, there was a black and white photograph. It was a picture of a woman. She was identical to me. I stared at the photo in my hands, my heart pounding in my chest. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I knew this woman wasn't a coincidence. Her expression, her eyes, it was as if she were a version of me, but with a look empty of any hope or happiness. I turned the photo over, searching for any clue, any name or date to explain what was happening, but it was blank. That photograph was enough to make me lose all sense of time. The feeling of being watched, of something following me, became even stronger. I could no longer trust what was around me. The diary was controlling me, leading me down a path of no return. How did this woman know so much about my life? What else could be hidden in this apartment? Then something even more disturbing happened. As I walked through the living room, I saw with a deep shiver the hallway light flickering on and off by itself. I glanced at the mirror, and there, reflected, was the same woman from the photograph. But she wasn't looking at me. She was smiling, a smile that wasn't human. My throat tightened, and it felt as though the air had suddenly disappeared. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, as if something was holding me there in front of that mirror. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. The sensation of paralysis was overwhelming. I knew something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't understand what was happening. The image of the woman smiling at me in the mirror seemed to come alive, distorting in a way I could no longer control. It was as if reality was disintegrating before my eyes, and everything I knew was being replaced by something much darker. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was hallucination. I felt a pressure on my back, like an invisible hand pushing me forward, forcing me to look once more into the mirror. And then, the voice I didn't want to hear, a soft, cold voice echoed inside my mind. You know what happened to her. You know what happens to everyone who comes here. Terror consumed me, my body trembling uncontrollably. I tried to pull away from the mirror, but the woman's words echoed louder in my head, more persistent. I could no longer escape the truth. That's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Not physically, but the presence, that invisible evil, was everywhere. I felt her eyes on me, as if she were inside my mind, watching every thought, every breath. I tried to run, but with every step I took, the walls seemed to close in on me, as if the apartment were alive, swallowing me whole. When I turned back, she was there, standing in the hallway, watching me with that senseless smile, with an expression I couldn't describe, but that was enough to shatter my sanity. The feeling of being watched grew even more intense. No matter how much I tried to distance myself, she seemed to be in every corner, every shadow of the apartment. I tried calling the police, but the line was dead. The voicemail messages on my phone kept piling up, each one more disturbing than the last, as if someone knew exactly what I was thinking. I knew I had to leave, but an invisible force seemed to hold me there, preventing me from walking away from it all. That's when a strange idea came to my mind. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, but a part of me insisted that I look at the diary one more time. If that woman knew so much about my life, maybe I could find something that explained everything. Something that could pull me out of this madness. I began flipping through the pages faster, almost desperately, until one page caught my attention. On it, a single sentence was written. She hides within all new tenants, waiting, watching, until you notice. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't know what it meant, but the feeling that her presence was closing in became even stronger. When I looked at the mirror again, my reflection wasn't the same. It wasn't me anymore. It was her. The woman. The same woman from the diary. She was smiling at me in a way that felt impossible, as if she were in control of everything. Panic consumed me, but something inside me, something dark and unfamiliar, pushed me to move closer to the mirror. I didn't want to, but my hands reached for the surface as if they were being controlled. When my finger touched the cold glass, an indescribable wave of pain shot through me, and her image, like a specter, stretched out and pulled me in. The sensation of being dragged into the mirror was indescribable. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. I was being pulled into another place as if swallowed by an invisible vortex. The last thing I heard was a soft laugh, almost like a whisper coming from inside the mirror. It was the woman who had lived in that apartment before me. She was taking me to the place where it all began. When I could finally breathe again, I found myself in a dark but familiar space. It was the apartment, but everything was distorted, as if I were in some kind of nightmare. The flickering light bulbs cast eerie shadows, and the air was heavy, oppressive. The mirror stood in front of me, but it was different now. It reflected a ruined environment, with broken furniture and crumbling walls. I could see my reflection again, but I wasn't alone. The woman stood beside me, smiling, as if she had been waiting for me all along. She watched me, her piercing eyes paralyzing me. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs were stuck to the floor, as if gravity had doubled. When I finally managed to take a step, the world around me began to disintegrate, as if reality itself were unraveling. I no longer knew what was real. I no longer knew if I was alive or if this was just some game orchestrated by an unknown force. All I knew was that somehow I should never have read that diary. I should never have stayed in that apartment. I never imagined that house sitting for my aunt while she was on vacation would turn out to be so strange. She was always very particular, and as her nephew, I was happy to help. It was a big house, located in a more isolated area, and while I felt a bit uneasy at first, it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. The first thing that made me start questioning everything happened one night, around 11 p.m. I was taking the trash out, something simple, but as soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed the motion lights in the garden flickering. That wasn't supposed to happen. They should only turn on when something moved nearby. I stood there, waiting, and then I saw a figure in the darkness. I couldn't make out much, but it was thin with a strange silhouette. I didn't know what to do, so I simply went back inside, locked the door behind me, and tried to ignore what I'd seen. The following nights were even more unsettling. Despite locking all the doors and windows before bed, I started hearing noises, soft footsteps and whispers coming from inside the house. Sometimes it felt like something was moving near my room, but whenever I checked, there was nothing there. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was probably just the wind or something trivial, but the next night, things got worse. While upstairs, I heard a door creak open. The sound was faint but distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. I went to the staircase and looked downstairs. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. It felt as though someone was there with me, in the house, waiting for the right moment to show themselves. I already knew something wasn't right, but it increasingly felt like the house was hiding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I started becoming paranoid. The constant feeling of being watched lingered, like something was just waiting for the right moment to approach. One particularly muggy night, I was sitting at my aunt's desk in her office when I heard a sound from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the old house creaking, as it often did, but then I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate, unmistakable. They weren't mine. I crept the stairs and stopped to listen. The footsteps grew closer. My heart raced as I cautiously descended, my mind spinning with fear. When I reached the bottom floor, the hallway was empty, but suddenly, a shadow moved quickly along the wall. My hand was clamming against the banister. I looked around, trying to find the source of the movement, but there was nothing, only silence. The strangest part of it all was that the feeling of being watched never went away. I could no longer tell what was real and what was my mind starting to unravel. In the days that followed, things only grew more intense. I began losing control, feeling as though the house was closing in on me. One day, I went out to the garden to investigate the motion lights again, only to find something even more disturbing. The lights were flickering once more, but now there was something else, a footprint. It wasn't from an animal, but a human. Small, like someone had been walking barefoot through the garden. I ran back inside, locking everything again, but when I glanced out the living room window, I saw a figure standing outside watching me. It didn't move, just stared at me from a distance, motionless. And then in an instant it was gone, as if it had dissolved into the darkness. My heart pounded, and I knew I wasn't alone in that house anymore. Fear completely consumed me, and I started losing focus on even the simplest daily tasks. I felt drained, as if I hadn't slept in days, and the constant feeling of being watched was unbearable. One night, I decided to take a risk. I went down to the basement, where the atmosphere felt heavier. I knew something was down there, but I had to find out what. Slowly, I descended the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder, and the musty smell was stronger than ever. At the very back of the basement, I found an old door I had never noticed before. When I opened it, I discovered what seemed to be a storage area filled with my aunt's personal belongings. Among the dusty boxes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A photo of me, taken inside that house, a photo I had never seen before. It was clear that someone had been watching me for far longer than I realized. But who? My aunt had never mentioned anyone entering the house, yet the presence I felt was undeniable. I didn't know what to do. It was clear that something sinister was happening, but I couldn't make sense of it. One night as I was having dinner, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, and when I answered, all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end. I didn't say anything. I just stayed silent, waiting for the other person to speak. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then a low, raspy voice whispered, "You are not alone in here." I nearly dropped the phone. The sound of the breathing grew louder, closer, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. The call abruptly disconnected. It was as if someone had been watching me, just to frighten me. The situation only worsened in the following days. Despite locking all the doors and windows, the noises continued. I heard footsteps upstairs, the sound of furniture slowly dragging across the floor at night, as if someone were pacing the house. I thought I was losing my mind, that my brain was playing tricks on me, but the feeling that something or someone was there never went away. One night, I decided to hide. I stayed behind my bedroom door, waiting to see what would happen when the lights went out. The sound of footsteps grew closer as always, but this time, something felt different. I saw a shadow, a figure moving, standing in the hallway. I froze, holding my breath, fear paralyzing me. The figure just stood there, unmoving, as if it knew I was watching. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The terror was so overwhelming, I nearly fainted. When I finally managed to flip the light switch, the figure was gone. The next day, my aunt returned from her trip. When I entered the house to greet her, everything was exactly as I had left it. But something felt off. The house carried a strange smell, one I couldn't identify. As we talked about her vacation, she began telling me stories about the house's history, things she'd never mentioned before. She spoke about the previous tenant, a man who had lived there long before she'd bought the property. He had been a family friend, but had mysteriously disappeared. When she described the man, my blood ran cold. It was the exact same figure I had seen. The terror returned, stronger this time. I no longer knew what was real or if I was losing my mind. All I knew was that something was in that house, something that didn't belong to this world, and I didn't know how much longer I could endure its presence. I spent the night awake, listening to the noises, the whispers, and the constant feeling of being watched. I could no longer tell if I was just imagining things or if there was something really there. However, the sense of unease continued to consume me. The next morning, my aunt was not home. She had gone to a meeting, and I was alone again once more. I decided to take a look at the back of the house near the garden where everything seemed to begin. When I got there, I saw something I couldn't understand. One of the windows was slightly open, and as I looked inside, I saw a figure in the dark, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I knew it wasn't my aunt. Whatever it was, it moved slowly, almost as if it were watching me, waiting for me to get closer. Suddenly, the porch lights started flickering again, and the figure vanished with terrifying speed. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed. I tried to run back inside, but my legs wouldn't respond. Fear was consuming me, and I knew that with every passing minute, something more sinister was drawing near. It was that night, when the house was too quiet, that I finally found something that made me understand what was happening. I rummaged through the house's old files, trying to find anything that would explain the events. That's when I found a photo, an old photo of my aunt when she was younger, with a group of friends. However, there was something strange about the photo. In a corner, in the distance, was a figure I recognized, the shadow I had seen in the garden, the same person who now seemed to be watching me. Upon looking closer, I realized the photo was not just an irregular album. It was strangely pinned, and something told me I shouldn't have touched it. The walls of the house seemed to be closing in on me, as if everything were trying to swallow me. At that moment, the frantic pounding of my own heart seemed to be the only real sound in that place. I knew something was very wrong with that house, and somehow it was all connected to my aunt, something she knew but never told me. The next night, events took an even more disturbing turn. I was in the living room, watching TV, trying to ignore the sensations that someone was watching me. Suddenly, a shadow passed quickly by the window. I got up and went to the back door, but there was nothing, just the silence of the night. The lights in the garden still flickered intermittently, as if something or someone was circling around the house. Fear started turning into panic. I locked all the doors, but the noise continued. It felt as if the house were alive in some way, testing me, waiting for the right moment to make me break. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. Every noise felt like a warning. Every creak of the house sounded like a sign. I closed the curtains, locking myself in the bedroom, but even so, the shadows seemed to dance through the crack in the windows. I tried not to look, but inevitably my gaze fell on that movement. And then everything got even stranger. In the middle of the night, a figure appeared in the doorway of my room, its silhouette distorted by the flickering lamp. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was inside the house with me. The next morning, I thought that maybe it was all just an illusion, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the stress. But then when I went to the kitchen to prepare something to eat, I noticed that the trash I had thrown out the night before was back at the back door. It made no sense. I was absolutely sure I had thrown that trash away and locked everything. That gave me a feeling of desperation, as if something were feeding off my fear, testing my limits. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I needed to leave that house as quickly as possible. I tried calling my aunt, but as usual, she was unreachable. She was somewhere far away, enjoying her vacation, and I was trapped in that house, which now felt like a trap. I decided to search the house again, hoping I might find a logical explanation for what was happening. When I entered the attic, something froze me in place. There was a large, dirty mirror in a corner, covered by a tarp. When I pulled it back, I saw reflected in it the figure I had seen in the living room window, but this time it was clearer, closer. It was there, in the mirror, watching me. I turned quickly, but there was no one in the attic. The house was silent again, but the air was heavy, as if the presence of that thing was still surrounding me. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was starting to lose track of time. The feeling of being watched never dissipated. Even when I locked all the doors and windows, the fear was still there like a shadow. I decided to spend the rest of the night awake, sitting on the couch, trying to find some rational explanation, but as the hours passed, the sounds got louder. I could hear light footsteps, as if someone were walking around me, but when I looked, there was no one. Sometimes I heard low sighs, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the hallway or the next room. I was losing my mind. The house seemed alive, as if it had a mind of its own. When the first rays of sunlight began to pour through the windows, I realized that the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, but it intensified. I needed to get out of there. I had already checked every corner of the house, every window, every door. There was no logical explanation for the events that were happening. Then, at the peak of my panic, I decided to try to escape. I grabbed my backpack, put some clothes in it, and left the house. The moment I was about to step out the front door, one last thing caught my attention. In the entrance mirror, something was written, in red, smudged letters, "You can't leave." The air grew denser, and I felt as if the house were trying to keep me there, as if I were being drawn back into its darkness. I was frozen. The mirror, now in front of me, seemed to pulse as if it were breathing. "You can't leave," the words repeated in my mind, and I couldn't understand what they were trying to tell me. Fear took over me in a way I had never experienced before. I tried to turn away, but something stopped me. A physical sensation that pulled me back into the house. The air was thick, as if it were getting denser with every second I hesitated. The front door was open, and I knew that if I took one more step, I could escape. But then the sound returned. A familiar noise like the creaking of the wooden floorboards, followed by a low, muffled laugh coming from somewhere upstairs. My mind was shattered. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if this was real. I took a deep breath and looked outside, as if I could find something familiar out there, something that would reassure me that everything was okay. But the garden was empty. I knew that even if I left now, something would follow me. Something was inside, watching me, waiting for me. I knew the house had something to do with all of this, but I couldn't understand what. I turned back to look at the mirror and I saw it. Not my reflection, but a figure behind me. It was the same shadow I had seen in the garden, but now it was clearer, more defined. That being, or whatever it was smiling. Not in a friendly way, but in a grotesque way, as if it had seen my hopelessness. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and the reflection smiled even more. A crooked smile, as if it knew something I didn't. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I could no longer trust my own eyes or my ears. Everything seemed distorted, as if the space around me was transforming into a nightmarish version of the house I was in. I slowly stepped away from the mirror, but every step I took seemed to pull me back to that place, as if something was stopping me from leaving, from escaping. The sound of the floorboards creaking came again, this time louder, closer. The frantic beating of my heart made everything seem more real. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I decided to run upstairs where the sound seemed to be coming from. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of what was happening was making everything harder. I needed to know what was up there. I didn't know why, but I felt that it was the only way to understand what was happening. As I climbed the stairs, the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, and I could barely make out the way. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. There was no light, just the shadow of what appeared to be a room ahead. The door is ajar. I don't remember how, but my hand was already on the doorknob, moving on its own as if the desire to understand what was happening was stronger than the fear. When I pushed the door open, the scene I saw made me freeze. In the center of the room, a large, dusty painting was hanging on the wall, but it wasn't just the painting that terrified me, it was what it depicted. It was a scene of the house, but distorted. The walls were covered in cracks, the floor seemed to sink, and in the middle of it all, a figure was watching with a penetrating gaze. The figure in the painting seemed alive, almost as if it were moving, watching me from every angle. My body froze, unsure of what to do. I tried to pull away, but something kept me from tearing my eyes away from the painting. There was a growing feeling that if I looked away, whatever was in that painting might manifest. I started to sweat, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might be heard throughout the neighborhood. My breathing became difficult and I could barely move. When I finally looked away, I realized that the shadow in the corner of the room had moved. It was no longer in the corner. Now, it was right behind me. I was overtaken by a cold sensation, as if an invisible hand were touching me, tightening around my throat, preventing me from breathing. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. It was as if my voice had been stolen by some greater force. The air around me seemed denser, more oppressive, and I was about to crumble under its weight. I looked back, but I saw nothing. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, it only intensified, as if I was being surrounded by something I couldn't comprehend. It was no longer just fear, it was terror. Finally, with the last shred of sanity I had left, I ran back to the stairs, falling down them, my head hitting the railing. I managed to get up and ran for the front door, desperate to get out. But when I tried to open the door, it was locked. I was trapped. Deep down, I knew the house wasn't going to let me leave so easily. That place seemed to have a life of its own, something malevolent, something that had been watching me long before I realized. Then I heard the sound of the floorboards creaking upstairs again, closer than ever. The sound of the floorboards creaking upstairs grew clearer, louder, as if someone was walking up there, but with dragging, heavy steps, as if the body were tired, almost defeated. I tried to open the door again, but nothing. My heart was in turmoil. I looked to the side and saw the stairs leading to the upper floor. I knew I shouldn't go up there, but the need to understand what was happening was stronger. I started to climb slowly, each step sounding like a scream in the darkness. The air was cold and it felt like the house was breathing with me, unevenly, as if it were a living creature. When I reached the top, everything was in an odd silence, the kind of silence that doesn't sound natural but uncomfortable. I looked around, searching for any sign of what could be chasing me, and then suddenly I heard a whisper. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something was calling me, or maybe warning me. The sound seemed to come from the guest room, which I didn't even know existed until that moment. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and opened the door. What I found inside made me stop in my tracks, my blood freezing in my veins. In the center of the room, on a chair, was an old coat, the fabric already worn by time. But what truly made me shudder was the reflection in the mirror above the chair. In the glass, a figure stood, so close that I almost felt its cold breath on my neck. I looked behind me, but there was no one there, just the empty coat and the mirror reflecting an image that shouldn't be there. The figure in the reflection was me, but something was wrong. My eyes were different, darker, and there was something distorted about it, as if I was no longer me. I could barely move, paralyzed by fear, the reflection of myself beginning to move in a strange way, as if it were distancing itself from my own image. I blinked, and each time my eyes opened, the figure in the mirror was farther away, until it disappeared completely. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. Was the exhaustion affecting me like this? But then the silence was broken again, this time with a crash coming from downstairs, as if something had fallen. I didn't hesitate. I ran down the stairs, not knowing what to expect. When I reached the living room, what I found made me freeze even more. The trash I had taken out earlier was scattered across the floor as if something had rummaged through it. But that wasn't all. A footprint, something dirty and sticky, was spread throughout the house, heading toward the kitchen door. I didn't know what was happening, but it was becoming clearer that something or someone was there with me, moving silently and waiting for the right moment to act. I began to feel a pressure in my chest, as if the air was becoming thicker, harder to breathe. I looked out the window, but everything was dark. The garden, where there had been twinkling lights before, was now in complete darkness. I knew something was approaching. Fear was consuming me, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I needed to leave, but when I tried to open the door, it was locked. Locked from the outside. And then the voice. Something soft, whispering my name, coming from inside the house. That voice, I didn't know where it was coming from. It was soft, but at the same time cold and distant. It seemed to drag through the air as if it were something more than just a human voice. I started to sweat, trying to stay calm, but my hands were trembling, and my breath was shallow. The door wouldn't open, and the house's lights started flickering again, as if some invisible force was toying with the energy. When I looked at the corner of the room, I saw something move slowly, a dark, distorted shadow crawling across the floor. It was as if it was approaching me, and I couldn't move. The sound of footsteps was now clear and unmistakable, but they weren't my footsteps. It was like something was dragging itself, something heavy, struggling, but with terrifying precision. When I quickly turned to look, the shadow was closer, almost within my reach. I couldn't breathe properly anymore. The feeling of being watched was so intense that it felt like something was inside my head, watching every thought. That's when I heard the front door slam, with such a loud bang that I almost fell to the floor. In my mind, that meant someone had entered the house, but what I didn't realize at the time was that the door was locked from the outside. I was alone. There was no one else there, except the invisible presence that seemed to be getting closer with every second. Then, with one last breath, something strange happened. The lights went out completely, and the sound of my breathing seemed to disappear as well. I couldn't hear anything anymore, as if the house had been swallowed by absolute silence. The darkness was thick and oppressive, as if something was completely enveloping me. I couldn't see anything anymore, but I could feel the presence around me, stronger than ever. Every movement I made seemed to be watched, as if invisible eyes were fixed on me. I tried to move toward the door, but something stopped me. It wasn't physical, but a sensation that something was holding me back, as if I was being pulled into the house, into something waiting. An indescribable terror took over me, and I began to feel my whole body freeze. When the lights finally came back on, the house was strangely silent. The air seemed heavier, and the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. The living room was exactly as I had left it, but I knew something had changed. I wasn't alone anymore, that was clear. Something or someone was there with an intention I couldn't comprehend. That's when I realized the flickering lights weren't just electrical failures. It was as if something was playing with me, testing my limits, making me feel more and more powerless. I ran to the front door, not looking back, and finally managed to open it. When I stepped into the street, the feeling of relief was instant, but I knew that somehow whatever was in the house was still there. Something in my mind told me that this wasn't over. Deep down, I knew the real terror wasn't in the shadows, but in what was waiting for me when I went back inside. When I moved into this house, I confess that I fell in love at first sight. The neighborhood had that charm from another era, with stone sidewalks and houses that looked like they came out of an old movie. My closest neighbor was the apartment next door, a semi-detached unit that at first glance seemed as well kept as the rest of the neighborhood. In the first few days, I was so busy unpacking that I hardly noticed anything strange. But then one night, when everything was quieter, I heard something. It was like voices, not too loud, but audible enough to make my heart stop for a second. I thought it was just some older neighbor watching TV late at night, or maybe the sound echoing from another house. But the voices started repeating every night, always around 11 p.m. They seemed like conversations, but the words were muffled, as if someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I spent days trying to ignore it until one day, while talking to the neighborhood janitor about the area, I mentioned the noisy neighbor next door. He looked at me with a strange expression and said something that sent a chill down my spine. But that unit has been empty for years. No one has lived there since the last tenant disappeared without a trace. I thought he was joking, but seeing the seriousness on his face, I decided to investigate for myself. After that conversation with the janitor, it stayed on my mind. I needed proof, so that same night I decided to pay closer attention. When the voices started, I turned off all the lights and sat on the floor right next to the wall that divided my room from the empty apartment. I held my breath, trying to make out what they were saying, but it was almost impossible to distinguish the words. What caught my attention was the tone. It sounded like people were arguing, but not in an explosive way. It was more desperate, like someone was begging for something. The strangest part was that at times I could swear I heard a dragging sound, like furniture being moved. The next day, I went over to the unit next door to confirm what the janitor had said. He wasn't lying. The door was locked with a rusty chain and padlock, and through the dusty windows I could see that the place was completely empty, but the strangest thing was noticing marks in the dust on the floor as if something had been dragged recently. I felt a chill and turned around before anyone saw me there. When I returned home, I started researching online about the apartment and its former residents. I found out that a family had lived there for almost 10 years before disappearing without a trace. No clues, no explanations, they just vanished. That night, the voices started earlier. I was exhausted from work and didn't have the energy for another night of paranoia, so I tried to ignore it. I put on headphones and distracted myself with a movie. But even so, it was impossible not to feel the presence of the voices, as if they were vibrating through the building's structure. When I took off my headphones to go to the bathroom, I noticed that the sound had changed. It was no longer just murmurs or muffled arguments. Now, it was as if someone was walking back and forth, heavily. The sound was coming directly from the ceiling. I climbed onto the bed, stretched my neck to get a better look at the structure, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The idea of something in the attic was impossible to ignore. I decided to call the janitor, but he answered saying it was late and that he would take care of anything in the morning. I hung up frustrated, but determined. I grabbed a broom and hit the ceiling 3 times on purpose, trying to scare whatever was up there. The response came almost immediately, 3 knocks back, firm and loud. The sound of the knocks froze me. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't something falling. It was a response. My heart seemed to beat as loudly as the knocks. I dropped the broom and backed into the corner of the room, never taking my eyes off the ceiling. The following silence was even worse. The feeling of being watched came back with full force, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as if something invisible was there, surrounding me. My mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe someone had entered the building without me noticing. Maybe there was an animal in the attic. But how could I explain the voices? How could I explain the knocks? I grabbed my phone and started recording. If it was my madness, at least I would have something to show someone later. I recorded for a few minutes, asking in a trembling voice if anyone was up there. Complete silence. It was almost worse than hearing a sound. I was about to stop the recording when a very low noise, like someone scratching the wood, emerged. Suddenly, a short, muffled laugh that made my blood run cold. It didn't sound human, or maybe that's what made it even scarier. I threw the phone on the bed, unable to deal with it. After that laugh, I decided I wasn't going to spend another night in that house without answers. I called my friend Carla, trying to stay calm, and asked her to come pick me up. I didn't explain the details, just told her I felt unsafe. While waiting, I sat on the couch with all the lights in the house on and a kitchen knife beside me, as if that could really protect me. Carla arrived about 30 minutes later, but those minutes felt like hours. When I finally heard her car parking in front of the house, I felt an immediate sense of relief. Before leaving, I gave one last look at the ceiling of the room as if I expected to see something there. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I locked the door and ran to the car. As I explained to Carla what had happened, I saw the lights in my room flicker in the rearview mirror. After that night, I decided not to return to the house until I got more information. I spent the next few days at Carla's house, researching the history of the neighborhood and trying to find anything about the former residents of the house next door. I only found vague information. Many properties on that street had stories of quick moves and no clear records of the last residents. My last attempt was to speak directly with the real estate agent who sold me the house. When I mentioned the voices in the unit next door, he went silent for a moment before responding, "The unit next door? That part has been vacant for decades. I don't even know if anyone's authorized to go in there." I was frozen. I decided never to go back alone. I hired a moving service, packed my things, and gave the house back. To this day, I avoid that neighborhood. And as for the voices, well, I never found out where they came from. But one thing I know, they weren't my imagination.